They always told us about one chain, the one forged across the Atlantic. The ships, the screams, the stolen lives. We've heard about the Europeans, skin pale as bleached bone, who stormed African lands, tearing apart kingdoms, families, and futures. But what if we told you there was another chain? One older, one longer, one that lasted over 1,300 years, and still echoes today. A chain wrapped not just in iron, but in silence. This is the buried truth of the Arab slave trade. A trade erased, minimized, and rarely spoken of in the textbooks. A human tragedy that unfolded across the Saharan dunes and the shores of the Indian Ocean. This is the story they never wanted you to know. From the 7th century to the 20th century, Arab traders conducted a massive, multi-regional slave trade that saw millions of Africans captured, sold, and killed. Unlike the transatlantic trade, this system went largely unchallenged, cloaked behind religious justification, regional politics, and cultural norms. It was not just a footnote to the European slave system. It was its own empire of oppression, known as the Trans-Saharan and Indian Ocean slave trades. The Arab slave trade operated across deserts and seas, turning vast landscapes into arteries of human suffering. Arabs raided, captured, and enslaved countless people, including fellow Muslims and Arabs, simply because their skin was black. In some regions, racial inferiority was codified using selective religious interpretations. Even today, in places like Mauritania, the ghost of this trade still lingers. Slavery wasn't outlawed there until 2007. In the public imagination, the Arab slave trade has all but vanished, reduced to whispers and academic journals. But its impact was catastrophic. Societies shattered, cultures lost, and generations erased. Before European colonizers sailed the Atlantic, Eastern Africa had already become a hunting ground. Arab merchants brutally captured Africans, trafficking them across a vast network that stretched from the Nile to the Persian Gulf. They provided labor not only for the Middle East, but also for parts of the classical world. Slave raids in Africa predated Islam, but with the rise of the Islamic caliphates in the 7th century, this trade exploded. While Islamic law proposed protections for fellow Muslims, black Africans were often excluded from such mercy, deemed suitable for enslavement by twisted interpretations. One of the earliest records of African slavery comes from ancient Egypt. During the reign of King Neferu, around the 3rd millennium BC, raids into modern-day Sudan were already capturing prisoners of war. These captives became slaves sent north. By the time of the Roman Empire, cities like Leptis Magna had established bustling slave markets. Slaves, especially black slaves, were often preferred as domestic workers for their exotic look. Roman Carthage actively imported enslaved people from across the Sahara. But it wasn't until the introduction of the camel that the trans-Saharan slave trade became industrial in scale. With camels, traders could travel vast distances, connecting Libya, Egypt, and the Maghreb to the interior of Africa. Arab traders soon forged alliances with African kings and chieftains. These leaders, in many cases, became middlemen, trading their own people or neighboring tribes in exchange for goods. A 9th-century Arab historian, Yaqubi, wrote, "The Arabs export black slaves belonging to the Zaghawa, Marwa, and other races whom they capture. I hear that black kings sell blacks without pretext and without war." The demand for black bodies was insatiable. The ancient geographer Al-Idrisi wrote of African regions that were constantly being raided. The people of Lemlem, he noted, were perpetually attacked by their neighbors, captured by the dozens, and sold to merchants. Children were especially vulnerable. Arab traders would use sweets, dates, specifically, to lure black children, leading them away before capturing and enslaving them. In a chilling quote, Al-Idrisi documented, "They steal the children of the Zanj, lure them with dates, and lead them place to place until they seize them." This wasn't just human trafficking. It was a full-scale ecosystem of exploitation. By the 14th century, travelers like Ibn Battuta recorded caravans carrying hundreds of black female slaves for use as domestic servants and concubines. These caravans often passed through brutal conditions. Hunger, exposure, and beatings were routine. Many never survived the journey. British explorers like Heinrich Barth relayed nightmarish stories. One such tale involved the vizier of Bornu losing 40 slaves in a single cold desert night. Skeletons littered the Sahara, grim evidence of those who never reached the markets. By 1858, the British consul in Tripoli reported that over 66% of the value traded across the Sahara was made up by slaves. Slaves sold in Alexandria and Constantinople had quadrupled in price, revealing the enormous economic incentive behind the trade. Muslim historian Ahmad ibn Khalid al-Nasiri lamented this atrocity. He wrote of the limitless enslavement of fellow Muslims. Black people sold and trafficked as though their faith meant nothing. They are trafficked like beasts or worse, he said, referring to the grim markets of 19th-century North Africa. Particularly disturbing was the treatment of male slaves. Many were castrated, an inhumane act aimed at preventing reproduction. According to estimates, 6 out of every 10 men died from the procedure. The death toll wasn't just from brutality during capture and transport. It extended to systemic mutilation and psychological terror. Millions were marched in chains, their feet swollen, their spirits broken. The sheer cruelty and scale have led some scholars to describe this as a veiled genocide. While the Sahara witnessed agony on its sands, the Indian Ocean told another story, one equally brutal but often ignored. From the Swahili coast to the Persian Gulf, Arab dhows, the traditional sailboats, hauled human cargo across vast waters. This was a sea of silence, with currents soaked in screams that never reached western shores. Zanzibar became the beating heart of this oceanic trade. Under the Sultanate of Oman, the island transformed into a hub of unimaginable horror. By the mid-1800s, up to 50,000 enslaved Africans were trafficked annually through its ports. The streets were filled with auction blocks. Black bodies, scared, starved, and shackled, were paraded before wealthy buyers from Arabia, India, and Persia. Slave markets were public spectacles. Buyers inspected teeth, limbs, and postures. Children were favored for their moldability, while women were valued for concubinage. Few found kindness, most found torment. Syed said, the Sultan of Oman, declared Zanzibar the capital of his empire. His wealth grew off black suffering. Spice plantations, particularly cloves, were run by slave labor. Entire villages in East Africa were emptied by coastal raiders. Arab slavers often used African mercenaries, known as Nyamwezi, to conduct inland raids. These hired soldiers marched deep into the Congo and Great Lakes regions, returning with chained men, women, and children. The brutality didn't stop at capture. The forced march to the coast was a gauntlet of starvation, disease, and death. They were chained, whipped, and marched across vast deserts. They were loaded into wooden ships and sold like livestock. But what they were not was silent. The history books rarely mention them. Hollywood never cast them. But make no mistake, resistance roared from within the shadows of the Arab slave trade. And many who were captured fought back with a fire that even centuries of oppression could not extinguish. Take the Zanj Rebellion, for instance, a massive uprising that shook the very foundations of the Abbasid Caliphate. In 869 CE, near the sweltering marshlands of southern Iraq, thousands of black slaves, mostly East Africans, rose up against their Arab masters. For over 15 years, they fought back, not just with stolen swords, but with tactics and discipline that rivaled professional armies. Their leader was Ali bin Muhammad, a Persian with a vision to unite the oppressed. The Zanj, as the Africans were called, didn't just raid plantations, they captured entire cities. They created a capital at Al-Muqtara and built mosques, courts, and markets. This wasn't just a rebellion. It was a nation built from blood and resilience. Historians estimate that nearly 500,000 people, both soldiers and civilians, died in the conflict. The Abbasids, one of the most powerful empires of their time, were humiliated. It took them over a decade and countless resources to suppress the rebellion. Yet today, the Zanj Rebellion is. But that was not the only resistance. Throughout the Swahili coast, enslaved Africans sabotaged ships, poisoned masters, and staged mass desertions. In the Comoros Islands, coastal raiders were often met with poisoned arrows and ambushes by local warriors. In Oman, multiple revolts forced sultans to build entire fortress networks to guard plantations. One of the lesser-known heroes of this era was Bwana Kari, a 19th-century caravan leader from present-day Tanzania who refused to traffic in humans. Instead, he protected villages from slavers and led counter-raids against Arab-backed militias. His reputation grew so fierce that some slave traders rerouted entire expeditions to avoid him. Even in Zanzibar, considered the epicenter of the East African slave trade, there were internal revolts. Some historians recount how enslaved Africans on spice plantations formed underground networks, sharing intelligence, sabotaging harvests, and plotting escapes. They sang coded songs, passed down secret maps, used the cover of monsoon storms to vanish into the forests. But resistance wasn't just physical. It was cultural, spiritual, emotional. Across the African continent, oral historians and griots preserve the memory of stolen sons and daughters. Songs were passed down lamenting those taken by the men with sails and the camel riders. Folk tales emerged with hidden warnings about strangers offering dates or carrying shiny beads. In Ethiopia, Islamic scholars pushed back against justifications for racial slavery, citing verses that condemned oppression and upheld human dignity. And some African kings, especially in the interior, refused to participate in the trade altogether. Among them was King Bihanzin of Dahomey, who fiercely resisted both European and Arab incursions. Though his kingdom was later overrun, his defiance became legendary. Still, for every rebellion that made it into fragmented records, hundreds more were erased, buried beneath the sands and waves. The question echoes through time: why has this chapter been forgotten? Some argue it's because the Arab slave trade didn't leave behind large diasporas like the Atlantic trade. The brutal reality? Most enslaved Africans in the Arab world did not survive long enough to establish communities. Men were castrated. Women were absorbed into harems or domestic labor, their children often erased from records or assimilated without lineage. Generational survival was rare. Others point to modern geopolitics. Many Arab nations have actively suppressed discussions of slavery, deeming it politically inconvenient or culturally taboo. Attempts to teach the subject in schools often meet resistance or outright denial. In 2009, when Mauritania's first anti-slavery law was passed, activists celebrated, but they also feared retaliation. Speaking openly about the legacy of Arab slavery could get you jailed, or worse. Some former slaves in Mauritania are still bonded to their masters by custom, fear, or economic dependence. The chain may no longer be made of iron, but it still binds. Even today, in countries like Sudan, Libya, and Saudi Arabia, migrant workers, especially from Africa, face conditions that closely mirror slavery: passport confiscation, 20-hour workdays, abuse, and no legal recourse. It's not called slavery, but it walks, talks, and smells like it. In Libya, footage emerged in 2017 of African migrants being auctioned off like cattle. The world gasped, but then moved on. But we can't move on, not until the full story is told. The Arab slave trade shaped centuries of African history, just as brutally, if not more so, than its Atlantic counterpart. To erase it is to erase millions. To forget it is to side with the oppressor. And to ignore the resistance, the Zanj, the village fighters, the cultural rebels, is to deny the strength that pulsed through our ancestors' veins. They fought. They bled. Some won. Most didn't. But all deserve to be remembered. So why don't we talk about this? Why, in classrooms around the world, do students learn about the transatlantic slave trade, but not the centuries-long Arab trade that devastated the African continent even earlier, and in some regions, even longer? The answer is uncomfortable. For many, it doesn't fit the narrative. It shatters simple binaries of oppressor and oppressed, colonizer and colonized. It reveals that black suffering was not just the result of European greed, but was exploited by many, including African elites and powerful Arab empires. And in a world where history is often filtered through political agendas, this chapter was quietly erased. Arab historians rarely documented the full brutality. European colonialists, seeking moral high ground, emphasized their own atrocities but downplayed or ignored Arab involvement. African leaders, still wrestling with tribal legacies, often looked away. And modern education systems, aiming to streamline complex histories, reduced thousands of years of suffering into a single page, or ignored it altogether. Even in Hollywood, there are no blockbuster films about the Indian Ocean slave trade, no high-profile documentaries about the Zanj rebellions, no memorials in Dubai, Muscat, or Cairo. But let's not be mistaken, the legacy is still here. In Mauritania, Black Mauritanians, descendants of enslaved people, continue to suffer discrimination and economic exclusion. Some still live as indentured servants, denied basic freedoms. Though slavery was legally abolished in 2007, enforcement remains weak, and cases still emerge in the 21st century. In Sudan, race-based slavery reappeared during the civil wars of the 1980s and 90s. Militias from the north raided the predominantly black south, abducting women and children. Many were sold into servitude in Khartoum and other cities, echoing ancient patterns. In Saudi Arabia, it wasn't until 1962 that slavery was officially abolished. In Yemen and Oman, it was even later. The echoes of this system still shape societal hierarchies, colorism, and class divisions in the region. And in East Africa, coastal communities remember the trauma. Oral histories speak of children taken in the night, of mothers who never saw their daughters again, of coastal paths stained by blood. These aren't just stories, they are inherited scars. But perhaps the most powerful silence is the cultural one. Unlike the transatlantic slave trade, which resulted in vast black diasporas in the Americas, the Arab trade left few lasting communities. Why? Because so many died, and those who survived, especially the men, were often castrated, unable to have children. The cultural erasure was nearly total. Few African-descended communities remain in the Middle East today, and those who do often face deep stigma. It's a genocide hidden behind trade routes. The Zanj Rebellion, the largest African slave revolt before the Haitian Revolution, took place in modern-day Iraq in the 9th century. For nearly 15 years, enslaved black laborers rose up against their Arab masters, seizing territory and shaking the Abbasid Caliphate to its core. Tens of thousands joined the rebellion, demanding dignity, humanity, and justice. Yet today, few outside academic circles know their names. No statues, no tributes, no school lessons. So what can we do? We speak their names. We tell their stories. We restore what history tried to erase. Understanding the Arab slave trade isn't about weaponizing guilt or shifting blame. It's about completing the truth. It's about honoring the resilience of those who endured, resisting the silence imposed on their legacy. It's about realizing that oppression wears many faces, and justice demands that we recognize them all. And most importantly, it's about ensuring that this story is no longer buried. Because the sands of the Sahara may forget, and the waters of the Indian Ocean may wash away blood, but we don't have to. History doesn't belong to the victors. It belongs to the witnesses. And now you are one of them. If this story moved you, don't let it end here. Share this video. Let the world hear the names history tried to erase. Comment below with your thoughts, your questions, your truth. We want to hear your voice. Subscribe if you believe more people deserve to know these buried chapters of Black history. Stories that challenge, that heal, and that empower. And if you know someone who still thinks slavery was only a Western crime, send them this. Sometimes, the truth needs a second telling. Together, let's uncover the stories they never wanted us to find. Because silence protects no one. But truth sets generations free.